The millionaire's bride wanted to humiliate his old school friend and ex-girlfriend, a humble teacher, by inviting her to their wedding among millionaires. But when she entered the hall, everyone froze. "This can't be," the bride said, and collapsed, losing consciousness. Hi there, and welcome to Moonlit Stories channel. Thanks for tuning in. Sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story. I think you're really going to love it. Edward Winscott pressed the elevator button to the 42nd floor, loosening the knot of his Italian silk tie. The $100 million contract for the new residential complex in Aspen had finally been signed. His phone vibrated, a message from Juliet, reminding him about the meeting with the wedding planner that evening. "Mr. Winscott, your mother is calling," interrupted his assistant, Charlotte, as soon as he entered the office. "I can't take it right now, Charlotte," he replied without turning around. "I need to review the trust fund agreement." "She insists it's urgent." Edward sighed heavily and picked up the phone. Eleanor Winscott's voice, his mother's, sounded more serious than usual. "Edward, have you sent out all the wedding invitations yet?" "Almost all of them, Mom." "What happened?" "Your Aunt Sophia told me something. Is it true that you invited Lillian Hayes?" In silence, Edward walked over to the massive window overlooking New York City. "Yes, I invited her." "Son, after all these years, you didn't do this just out of politeness." Edward squinted, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His mother always had an annoyingly accurate intuition. "This is my wedding. I can invite whoever I want." His mother remained quiet momentarily before saying, "The last time I saw her, she had just finished teacher's college. A wonderful girl. She doesn't deserve—" "Mom, I have a meeting. We'll talk later." He hung up, but continued staring out the window for a long time. Then, opening her social media profile on his phone, he scrolled through her recent posts. In the latest photo, Lillian is surrounded by children in a modest classroom. Her smile looks as sincere as he remembers, unlike Juliet's practiced poses in her endless posts. His assistant interrupted his thoughts again. "Juliet is here, sir." Juliet entered like a whirlwind, exuding the scent of expensive perfume and the sharp click of designer heels. "Darling, have you finalized the guest list?" "The planner is waiting for the exact number for the banquet at the estate." "Yes, I added one more person." "Who?" "Lillian Hayes." Juliet dropped her designer clutch onto the oak table. "Your school friend? The teacher?" "Yes, her." A faint smile, tinged with mockery, appeared on Juliet's perfectly painted lips. "How intriguing, Edward. Do you think she'll come?" "I don't know. I just sent the invitation. I hope she will." Juliet stepped closer, adjusting his tie. "I can already picture her face when she sees what you've become, and everything that belongs to the woman who truly deserves you." Edward kept his expression calm, but a wave of unease swept through him. The memory of his last evening with Lillian before he left to study in England flashed through his mind like lightning. "It's just an invitation, Juliet." "Of course, darling, just an invitation." She exited with the same air of superiority with which she had entered. Edward glanced back at Lillian's photo. For a moment, he could almost hear the voice of his 18-year-old self, dreaming of changing the world alongside her. Closing the page, he buried himself in the trust fund documents. Numbers don't lie, don't judge, and don't remember broken promises. The restaurant Celestial buzzed with the low hum of New York's elite in conversation. Juliet spread out the guest list on the pristine linen tablecloth, while Edward sipped a glass of red wine. "The Brewster family confirmed their attendance," she noted, crossing their names off, with her Mont Blanc pen. "Father insists that the governor sits at our table." Edward glanced at his phone screen. An unread email notification blinked. It was Lillian's RSVP confirming her attendance. "Are you even listening to me?" Juliet tapped her pen against the table. "The governor can sit wherever he wants," Edward replied. "The Spanish ambassador has also confirmed. We'll have to reshuffle the guests in the East Wing." Edward's attention drifted back to Instagram. In Lillian's latest post, her students were rehearsing a play based on War and Peace by Tolstoy. "So proud of my little actors," the caption read. "What are you so engrossed in?" Juliet leaned over the table. "It's work, Juliet. Liar. She deftly snatched the phone from his hand.
Lillian? Seriously, Edward? Checking if she got the invitation? You know what? He began, but Juliet was already scrolling through his screen.
Perhaps I'll seat her with our relatives from Cleveland. She can chat about her teaching achievements. Juliet, stop. Or maybe with Cecilia Bradford? She just got married for the third time. Plenty to talk about. The waiter arrived with their main courses. Edward cut into his steak with noticeable tension. Why does this matter so much to you? He asked. You're the one who invited her. It doesn't matter to me. Seat her wherever you want. Then it settled. Table 16, with the relatives? She made a note in her guest list.
Cecilia can give her advice on how to marry well, Juliet continued mockingly. For a moment, Edward's mind wandered to Lillian helping him study physics, sharing sandwiches she had made herself.
I don't need to be rich, she had said back then. I just want to do something meaningful. I'll seat her at table 8 with the entrepreneurs, Edward declared.
Darling, that's absurd.
She's my guest. You asked where to seat her, and I've decided.
Juliet studied his face intently. As you wish. Maybe that will be even more entertaining. She took a sip of champagne. We must include her in the brunch the next day. Let her feel special.
Edward recognized that tone. It was the same one she used when plotting how to eliminate those who stood in her way.
When the waiter cleared their plates, Edward ordered a double whiskey. By the way, Juliet continued, Mother suggested using the family silver for the head table. The same set from grandmother's wedding in London.
Edward nodded absent-mindedly. In his mind, he pictured Lillian again, sitting in the school library, explaining problems to him. Her eyes sparkled with dreams that couldn't be bought. The old school Edward had once attended looked just as it had years ago. He parked his black Mercedes by the green wrought iron fence where Lillian had waited every morning. A wave of nostalgia hit him, sudden and overwhelming. September 2004. The school corridor buzzed with noise. Students hurried to their classes, some loudly discussing their projects, others simply trying not to be late. Amid the chaos, Lillian was carefully carrying a large model of the solar system, balancing it delicately to avoid dropping any of the planets. At one particularly narrow turn in the hallway, she almost collided with a boy, who also seemed to be in a rush. "Watch out!" she called, but it was too late. A large plastic Jupiter, meticulously painted, fell to the floor and rolled straight to the boy's feet. "Sorry," she exclaimed, quickly kneeling to gather the scattered pieces. But the boy had already picked up Jupiter and handed it back to her. "It's fine. Is this a planet?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he tried to suppress a laugh. "Jupiter, to be exact," she clarified, carefully taking the sphere from him. "It's part of my model." "Got it. You must be one of those people who likes everything to be perfect." Lillian shot him a brief glance, but then smiled as well. "I just try not to be late." "You're not the only one," he admitted, glancing down the hallway. "By the way, I'm Edward." "Lillian," she replied, already using tape to fix the spot where the planet had come loose. "You wouldn't happen to be heading to Mr. Lawson's physics class, would you?" "I am. And if we stand here for another minute, we're both going to get kicked out," she said, hurrying forward without waiting for a response. "Wait." Edward caught up to her, smiling. "Has anyone ever told you that you look like someone who only gets straight A's?" "Has anyone ever told you that you talk too much?" she retorted, though her tone carried a hint of amusement. "Fair enough," he agreed, keeping pace with her. As they approached the classroom, Lillian hesitated, still holding her model. "Do you think he'll say anything about us being late?" "If he notices you're carrying an entire solar system, he'll probably forgive you," Edward joked. "But I wouldn't count on it." She laughed, her laughter echoing down the hallway. "You're good at cheering people up, but it seems you like being late even more." "Well, let's see who gets a warning first," he replied, opening the door and stepping aside to let her in. From that day on, they often stayed in the library after school. Lillian had an incredible talent for explaining complex problems through simple analogies, making even the toughest topics seem approachable. "Equations are like recipes," she used to say. "Just follow the steps." In the evenings, Edward often visited her home. Her mother, Anna,
would always bring them tea with jam and freshly baked pastries. They dreamed and made plans together.
"I want to build schools," Edward said one evening. "Not those gray boxes, but bright buildings with gardens, laboratories, and big libraries."
"And I'll work in one of them," Lillian replied, leaning her head on his shoulder.
In their final year of school, Edward received a scholarship to study at Oxford. Lillian helped him prepare his applications, corrected his essays, and celebrated his success when the official acceptance letter arrived.
"You're going to change the world," she told him that evening as they stood on the observation deck, gazing at the New York City skyline.
"Come with me." "You know I can't. My family needs me." They kissed under the stars, promising to write to each other.
For the first few weeks, they kept their promise. But then, Oxford pulled Edward into its whirlwind. New friends and new priorities emerged. Lillian's letters arrived less frequently, and Edward's replies grew shorter. One day, he found a photograph in the mail. Lillian stood in her graduation gown from the teaching university, surrounded by her family. "I did it," the message read. "What about your schools?"
Edward never replied. Now he stood by the same wrought iron fence where their story had begun. In his rearview mirror, the gray school building faded along with his memories.
"Miss Hayes! Miss Hayes!" a small voice called out. Little Emily waved her notebook enthusiastically. "I finished my math assignment." Lillian, standing at the chalkboard, turned to the girl and walked to her desk. "Well done, Emily. Let's take a look."
Jefferson Elementary School buzzed with the lively chatter of third graders, busy solving multiplication problems. Posters adorned the walls, along with a map of the United States, a multiplication chart, and a model of the solar system they'd crafted together a month ago out of clay and cardboard.
"Miss Hayes, can you help me?" another student, Mark, called out, raising his hand.
Lillian started toward him when the school secretary, Miss Carter, appeared at the door.
"Miss Hayes, this is for you." She handed her an envelope, its elegant design making it stand out.
"It looks important." The bell rang for recess. The children ran out into the yard laughing, leaving their notebooks scattered on the desks. Lillian sat down at her desk, holding an envelope in her hands, studying it. The paper was thick with gold embossing. "Edward Winscott and Juliet Aldridge invite you to their wedding celebration." Her hands trembled slightly.
"Something bad?" Miss Carter asked.
"No, just a wedding invitation," Lillian replied, folding the envelope. Through the window, she watched her students playing soccer with an old ball that was worn out by time. Her phone buzzed. A message from her sister. "Are you home? I need your help picking a dress for Anna's graduation. Stop by when you're done." The time until the end of the lessons passed quickly. Division by 3-digit numbers was followed by an explanation of the properties of substances. Then came the moment when the last student hugged her goodbye and ran out into the schoolyard. Lillian opened the envelope again, carefully rereading the text. Then she turned on her old laptop, purchased on installment last year, and typed Edward's name into the search engine. The headlines were brimming with news. Edward Winscott, the new face of American real estate, Winscott Group launches a $100 million project in Aspen. In the photographs, he looked different. Perfect suits, expensive watches, a flawless smile. Next to him was a blonde in an evening gown and jewelry worth more than her school's annual budget. Lillian closed the laptop, packed her bag with notebooks to grade, and turned off the fan. Her neat math notes still adorned the chalkboard. As she left the classroom, she noticed a ball her students had left under an old tree. She picked it up and thought about buying a new one with her first paycheck. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty schoolyard. In her bag, she held the invitation like a fragment of the past that had unexpectedly resurfaced. Lillian's apartment smelled of freshly brewed coffee and pastries from the bakery next door. Her sister Claire was examining the wedding invitation lying on the kitchen table as if it were a ticking time bomb. "Are you going to go?" she asked, pouring coffee into cups. "I don't know," Lillian replied, absent-mindedly tracing her finger over the golden letters. "Have you seen the news?" Claire nodded toward her phone. Lillian opened Instagram. Juliet's page was filled with photos from yachts in Monaco, fashion shows in Milan, and high society parties. In the latest photo, she and Edward posed for a magazine cover. "There'll only be his rich friends at the wedding," Claire continued, "people who spend more on dinner than we make in a month."
I don't care how much money they have. Lillian set down her phone.
They care. Do you know how much a wedding in that Hampton estate costs? I think it's a trap. Claire dipped her pastry into her coffee. Lillian smirked, but doubt flickered in her eyes. Why do you think that? Because invitations like this aren't just gestures of politeness. He wants to show you who he is now, or who you are to him, Claire said, taking another sip of coffee and wincing at the bitterness. Lillian sighed, lowering her gaze to the invitation. Maybe it's just old friendship? Old friendship? Listen, people don't change. And Edward Winscott was never a simple guy. You always knew he'd choose his career. Lillian stood and walked to the window. Outside, the evening city buzzed with life. Children rode bikes, and someone walked their dog. She watched it all as if trying to find an answer in the flow of life. I don't know why he did this. Maybe he just wanted to ease his guilt. Or maybe he wants to make sure I'm doing okay. Or her phone buzzed again. It was her mom. Are you coming to dinner on Sunday? Dad's making lasagna. If I don't go, they'll think I'm upset. Don't tell me you're not upset. Lillian got up to take bread out of the cupboard. Next to the dishes hung an old photo of her on graduation day, holding her teaching diploma. It was the same photo she had once sent to Edward. It's been 12 years, Claire. Then why invite you now? Silence hung in the room. Outside, the setting sun painted the city's old rooftops in hues of orange. I'll need a dress, Lillian finally said. I have that blue dress I wore to Aunt Isabella's wedding, Claire suggested. It's simple but elegant. That's perfect, Lillian replied, gazing thoughtfully at the invitation glinting under the kitchen light, like a promise or a challenge. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the school chat. Thank you, Miss Hayes, for teaching our kids about the solar system. Sam won't stop talking about planets. Lillian smiled. This was her life now. Kids, lessons, and Sunday dinners with family. You know what? I'll go, she said firmly. Claire gave her a long look. Are you sure? Yes, Lillian replied, tucking the invitation back into its envelope. Because I'm no longer that girl who believed his promises. There was a resoluteness in Lillian's eyes as she spoke, as if the invitation had ceased to be a burden from the past and transformed into an opportunity to finally put everything in its rightful place. The sun dipped fully below the horizon, leaving the sky crimson. On her bedside table, Lillian placed the invitation to wait until July, understanding that sometimes returning to the past is the best way to ensure your present is exactly where it should be. The offices of Prestige Events Co. occupied the top floor of a sleek high-rise in the heart of Manhattan. Juliet watched with genuine enthusiasm as Victoria Sterling, the wedding coordinator, carefully arranged place cards on a model of the estate. The head table is the focal point, Juliet explained. I want the Brewster family seated near Lillian Hayes. The teacher from your school? Victoria confirmed, glancing at her tablet. Exactly. Her table should be close to the main one. And one more thing, Juliet added with a subtle smile. Mrs. Bradford from London is bringing her new sapphire necklace. I'm sure they'll find something to talk about. Victoria nodded, jotting down notes. The Holloway relatives have also confirmed their attendance. Excellent, Juliet replied, her smile widening like a cat with a mouse firmly in its grasp. Her phone rang. It was Edward. Darling, what's wrong? Why did you invite Lillian to the brunch? To make her feel like part of the celebration, Juliet answered with feigned softness. It wasn't my idea, Edward snapped. Edward, everything's already been finalized. Canceling her invitation now would be rude. She ended the call, turned to Victoria, and smiled. What about the central arrangements with white orchids? They've already been delivered, confirmed the coordinator. Juliet walked over to the panoramic window, which offered a view of the Hudson River stretching under the evening sun. On her wrist, Cartier watches gleamed, a gift from Edward for the first anniversary of their relationship. And one more thing, Victoria, she added, not turning around. Find me the phone number of Lillian Hayes. For what? I want to personally make sure she feels at home.
Victoria hid her surprise and continued working, but inside, she realized that Juliet was planning something more than just a kind gesture. For Juliet, humiliation was an art form, and she was a true master of her craft. In the room that smelled of old books and memories, Lillian and Claire were sorting through dresses in Grandma B's old wardrobe. The grandmother sat in her rocking chair, gently stroking the cat, and watched her granddaughters with interest. "This blue one would suit you," she pointed out, as Lillian pulled out a simple but elegant silk dress. "I wore this to your sister Sophia's wedding." The dress was classically cut, knee-length with a neat neckline. "Try it on," Claire insisted. Lillian stepped into the bedroom and looked into the old mirror. The dress fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her. "I have something else," said Grandma, struggling to rise from her chair. She opened a drawer in the antique chest and took out a small velvet box. "This is too much, Grandma," Lillian started to say, but she was interrupted. "Your grandfather gave me these pearls on our 15th wedding anniversary. It's time they passed to the next woman in our family line." The elderly hands fastened the necklace around her neck. The small pearls were subtle, but they glowed with a special tenderness. "They're beautiful," Claire breathed, holding back tears. "Now you look like a real lady," Grandma said with a smile, "but not one who tries to show off her wealth. Let them see that elegance can't be bought." Lillian looked in the mirror. In its reflection, she saw a woman who was confident and beautiful in her simplicity. "Why are you really going there?" Grandma asked, returning to her chair. "Because I was invited." "Lillian, don't try to deceive me. I've known you since you were a baby." Silence filled the room. The cat lazily stretched, hanging a paw off the arm of the chair. "I'm going to put a period on it," Lillian confessed. Grandma nodded. "The pearls are yours." She raised her hand to stop her granddaughter's protest. "Don't argue. It's time to pass them on." Claire started looking for the right shoes, while Lillian carefully folded the dress and the pearl necklace, placing them in a fabric bag. Before leaving, Grandma took Lillian's hand. "Remember, my dear, real aristocracy is not what you wear, but how you hold your head high." The sunlight, streaming through the old windows, played on the pearls, turning them into symbols of dignity. The elite restaurant Lumiere, a meeting place for New York's upper crust, hummed with quiet conversations. Juliet was at the head of a table of 10 women, wives and fiancées, of the most influential partners of the Winscott Group. "So, you're saying she was his high school sweetheart?" Diana, the wife of one of the investors, asked, twirling a napkin between her fingers. "An amazing story," Juliet responded, taking a small sip of martini. "It seems Edward wants to show generosity to his past." "And she's a teacher at a regular school?" Maria, the wife of the main shareholder, asked, leaning in toward Juliet. "At a regular public school," she smiled in response. Light laughter followed. "Does she already have a dress, or is she going to show up in her school uniform?" Another woman asked casually. "I have no idea. She might buy one from a thrift store," Juliet said with a smirk. At the other end of the room, Edward was having lunch with his partners, paying no attention to the conversation. "And she'll be sitting at our table, huh?" Maria asked with a slight mockery. "Of course." Juliet set her glass aside. "I want her to feel comfortable." "How sweet of you," Diana said, with barely concealed sarcasm. The waiter brought a second round of cocktails. The conversation returned to social news. But the topic of the provincial teacher lingered in the air, like expensive perfume. At the other end of the restaurant, Edward glanced at his watch. Half an hour later, he was due for a video call with foreign investors. His phone vibrated. A notification appeared on the screen. Lillian Hayes confirmed her attendance. "Mr. Winscott." A quiet laugh drifted from Juliet's table. Edward frowned. For a moment, he felt the weight of what he had set in motion. Asking for the check, he left, leaving behind the restaurant and conversations that were growing increasingly venomous. The estate in Hampton rose amid manicured gardens, like a postcard from the past. Lillian looked at the grandeur from the taxi window. Stone fountains, arched columns, gravel paths. Everything seemed too luxurious for her modest blue dress
and pearl necklace. Are you sure it's here? The taxi driver asked, turning to her.
Yes, she replied, handing him the money.
Thank you. At the entrance, a man in a sharp suit greeted her. Your invitation, please.
Lillian took the envelope from her purse, and he examined it with a tablet. Table number 8. Please follow me.
She walked across the stone-paved courtyard, lit by twinkling lanterns. White orchids cascaded from arches, candles floated in fountains, and waiters in white gloves served champagne in crystal glasses. Lillian? The voice of Eleanor Winscott, Edward's mother, brought her out of her thoughts. She approached in an elegant burgundy dress. Her smile was sincere, and her embrace was warm.
You look stunning, darling. Mrs. Winscott touched her necklace. Is this from your grandmother?
Yes, Lillian replied, slightly embarrassed.
The best jewelry is always family heirlooms. Come on, let me take you to your table, she added. As they walked, Lillian could feel the eyes on her. The guests whispered, clearly evaluating her. A woman with an emerald necklace was watching particularly intently. Their table was near the dance floor. Mrs. Winscott introduced Lillian to the other guests.
This is Lillian Hayes, our special guest. Lillian smiled politely, keeping her composure. Her experience with parents of students helped her remain calm in any situation. People have told me a lot about you, Mrs. Bradford said, fiddling with her necklace.
Lillian didn't have time to respond. A commotion rippled through the hall, and everyone turned. Edward appeared, accompanied by Juliet, glowing in her designer dress. Their gazes met for a moment, but that was enough for Lillian to feel the weight of memories. She held her head high, remembering her grandmother's words, and realized her blue pearls glowed with restrained, natural elegance against the bright shine of others' jewelry. The hum of conversations and the clinking of glasses filled the evening atmosphere. Lillian sat at her table, watching as guests moved from conversation to dancing. She held her champagne glass carefully, hardly touching the drink. So, what's it like to teach at a regular school? Came Mrs. Bradford's softly venomous voice. Lillian smiled calmly. It's very inspiring. Recently, one of my students won a federal math competition. Against students from private schools? The man sitting across from her asked with interest.
Yes, Lillian replied. William has amazing skills with numbers. Impressive, he remarked. Mrs. Bradford squinted slightly, adjusting her necklace. I've heard that schools now get small budgets and teachers buy everything with their own money, right? Creativity often helps overcome challenges. For example, we recently made a model of the solar system out of old boxes and plastic bottle caps. The kids were thrilled, more so than if we had gone to the planetarium. How charming, Mrs. Bradford drawled with a faint smirk. I'm sure the kids were thrilled. After all, that's probably all they can afford, right? Lillian felt the tension hanging in the air around the table. A few women exchanged furtive glances. That's not true, she replied calmly. For children, the process and knowledge are more important than material expenses. Of course, chimed in another woman, Maria, adjusting her massive necklace. But sometimes, I think creativity is just an excuse, when there's no money, for proper education. Lillian pretended not to notice the sharpness, but her hand subtly gripped the stem of her glass. By the way, Mrs. Bradford suddenly said, looking at Lillian challengingly, your dress is simply charming. I'm sure it has an interesting story. Did you make it yourself? Lillian paused. She knew there was mockery hidden behind those words, but allowed herself a slight smile. No, this dress belonged to my grandmother. She gave it to me as a reminder that elegance doesn't need labels. For a moment, silence hung over the table. Lillian's response was so calm and confident that the women didn't immediately know what to say. A real family, one of the women seated nearby remarked, attempting to change the subject. What a touching gesture. Mrs. Bradford grimaced but remained silent, pretending to be absorbed in her glass. At the other end of the garden, Edward and Juliet were watching the scene unfold. Your school friend is surprisingly composed, Juliet remarked, her voice low but filled with irritation. It seems provincial manners are helping her here too. Edward didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on Lillian, who continued the conversation at the table with ease, despite the attempts to humiliate her. He saw in her the same strength and confidence that had inspired him many years ago. "She's always been like this," he muttered more to himself than to Juliet.
"What?" she asked, surprised.
"Nothing," he quickly replied, looking away.
The evening was approaching its climax.
Juliet, all in the sparkle of jewels and elegance, drew attention as she raised her champagne glass. Her voice was bright, confident, but anyone who knew her well could detect an underlying sharpness. "Dear guests," she began, scanning the room, "how wonderful it is to see so many remarkable people here with us today. Today, we celebrate not only love, but also the successes, achievements, and dreams that have come true." Her gaze slowly drifted across the room and landed on Lillian. "I am especially pleased that some of us are here today to see how far we've come since we sat together in school." Lillian felt the guest's eyes turn toward her. She remained calm, though her fingers subtly tightened around the stem of her glass.
"You know, our Edward has been ambitious since his youth," Juliet continued. "Even back then he dreamed of high heights, and as we can see, he has reached them. Skyscrapers, millions, international projects, all of this is his achievement." Some guests applauded, and Juliet smiled sweetly. But let's not forget other paths as well. For instance, those who chose a more modest but noble pursuit. She paused, ensuring that everyone's attention was back on Lillian. "Miss Hayes, you're a teacher, aren't you?" she asked with feigned warmth in her voice. "Yes," Lillian answered calmly.
"How inspiring," Juliet continued, "to dedicate your life to education. But I'm curious, how do you manage with such limited resources?" Some of the guests giggled. "For example, your dress," Juliet added, feigning admiration. "It's something vintage, right?" "Did you make it yourself?" The attention shifted back to Lillian. "No," Lillian responded calmly. "This dress belongs to my grandmother. It reminds me that elegance cannot be bought." Silence briefly filled the room, but Juliet didn't back down. "How lovely!" she exclaimed. "That's your charm, finding beauty in simplicity. I'm sure your students are proud of you." She emphasized the last word, adding a hint of mockery. "Of course," she continued, "it must be hard for them to imagine what it's like to live in a world like ours." "They don't need to imagine it," Lillian answered, her voice steady but firm. Juliet raised her glass. "Then let's drink to Lillian, who has proven that even in modesty, one can find their charm."
Her words sounded mocking, and some guests understood where she was heading, but Lillian didn't allow herself to show irritation. "Thank you, Juliet," she said with a slight smile.
"I'd also like to raise a glass," Lillian said, "to people being able to maintain kindness and respect, no matter where they are." Her words elicited mixed reactions. Some applauded, while others looked embarrassed. Edward, standing nearby, observed the scene. When Lillian glanced at him, she noticed how he nervously gripped his glass, clearly displeased with his fiancée's behavior.
Juliet, sensing that her toast hadn't had the desired effect, returned to her seat, still smiling. Mrs. Winscott, Edward's mother, approached Lillian. "You handled that beautifully, dear," she quietly said. "Not everyone can withstand blows with such grace." "I'm used to it," Lillian replied, giving a barely perceptible smile. But deep down, she felt that Juliet's words had left a mark.
When Juliet finished, Lillian gently leaned back, folded her napkin, and stood up. "Leaving already?" Daniel asked, rising to stop her. "I have lessons tomorrow," she replied. "I need to prepare." "Let me call you a car." "Don't worry. I've already ordered a taxi," she assured him. On her way out, she approached the main table to say goodbye. "Thank you for the invitation," Lillian said, handing Edward a package with a book. "I hope you have a happy life." Edward took the book, recognizing it. It was a collection of poems they had once read together in the school library.
"I'll escort you," Mrs. Winscott interjected, rising from her seat.
Lillian nodded gratefully. They walked through the garden towards the exit. Mrs. Winscott firmly took her arm and quietly said, "You've remained the same as you've always been, Lillian." That is worth more than all the millions my son has." "Thank you," Lillian replied, feeling the sincerity in those words. A taxi was already waiting at the gates. Before getting in the car, Lillian hugged Mrs. Winscott. "Promise to come by, but without all the showiness," she said. "I will," Lillian smiled. The car drove off. Through the window, she glanced back at the estate where Edward stood with the book in his hands, not taking his eyes off her. Their gazes met for a moment, and Lillian smiled gently, without reproach, but with the confidence of someone who had chosen the right path. Her world remained where children made solar systems out of cardboard and dreamed about the future. The next morning at Jefferson Elementary School, everything was back to its usual hustle and bustle. Children were loud in the corridors, teachers were discussing lesson plans, and Lillian walked down the long, bright hallway to her classroom. Her life was returning to its normal rhythm, as if the previous evening had just been a dream. When she entered the classroom, her students were already at the board, trying to draw new planets for their next project. "Miss Hayes, were you at a wedding yesterday?" Emily asked, turning to her with a wide smile. "Yes, Emily," Lillian answered, smiling faintly. "But now, we have a lot of work to do." "Let's see what you've done." Emily tugged on her hand, showing her a multicolored drawing, and Sam was already holding a chart with orbital calculations. Lillian felt warmth from their energy and enthusiasm, returning to her reality, the one far more important than the glitter of yesterday. By lunchtime, when the students had gone for their break, Lillian noticed a dark car parked in the schoolyard. She didn't immediately recognize who it might be, but a few minutes later, Edward appeared at the classroom door. He was dressed in a formal suit but looked unusually tense. He was holding a folder. "Edward, what are you doing here?" Lillian asked, surprised, approaching him. "I came with an offer," he began, handing her the folder. "The Winscott Foundation wants to launch a school support program. We are offering scholarships for students, training for teachers, and new equipment." Lillian silently opened the folder. Inside were detailed plans, from financial support to projects involving gardens and libraries. "Why did you decide to do this?" she asked, lifting her gaze to him. Edward lowered his eyes. "Because someone reminded me of who I wanted to be." Voices from the classroom could be heard, with the children loudly discussing their new projects. One of them, Sam, ran out into the hallway, holding a drawing. When he saw Edward, he froze, but Lillian encouraged him with a smile, and he ran off again. "We don't need charity," she said calmly. "This isn't charity, Lillian. It's redemption." She was silent for a moment, studying the documents. "If you're serious, you need to present this project to the school board for discussion and follow all the procedures." "I'm ready," she nodded, closing the folder. "By the way, Saturday lessons start at 9, if you really want to remember what it's like to build something meaningful." Edward smiled, sensing a bit of irony in her words, and looked into the classroom through the open door. There, the children were enthusiastically drawing and debating which color to paint their models. Lillian returned to the classroom, leaving Edward in the hallway. Her silhouette, confident and calm, was exactly what had captivated him back in their school days. Edward loosened his tie and stepped outside. This time, his departure didn't feel like an end, but more like the beginning of a new path. Weeks passed, and Jefferson Elementary School became a place of activity. The students watched as workers installed new equipment in a designated room for the future science lab. The most excitement was caused by the telescope that had just been brought in and was being prepared for installation. Lillian stood on the porch, watching the bustle. Daniel, a representative from the Winscott Foundation, who was actively involved in the project, approached her. "Everything is going according to plan," he informed her. "The classroom will be ready by the beginning of next month." "Thank you, Daniel. Your contribution to our school is truly important." "It's not just my contribution," he smiled. "Edward is actively involved, and you know this isn't just a donation. He genuinely wants to do something useful." Lillian nodded slightly, but didn't pursue the topic. That same day, in the evening, Edward came to the school again. This time, he wasn't dressed in a suit. Wearing jeans and a shirt, he looked much simpler and more natural. "Hello," he said, walking up the stairs. Am I interrupting? No, you're on time. We're just discussing the project. They entered the almost finished classroom, where new microscopes were laid out on the tables, and star maps were hung on the walls. Do you remember when you wanted to build schools with gardens and libraries? Lillian asked, looking at him. I remember, he quietly replied, surveying the room. It looks like you're actually starting to do it, she added with a faint smile. Edward walked up to one of the tables, where a model of the solar system made by the students lay. He ran his hand over the paper planets. This is your work, Lillian. You inspire the children. She turned her gaze away, not wanting him to notice her embarrassment. Everyone has their place, Edward. Mine is here. Maybe mine is here too, he said unexpectedly, with a note of hope in his voice. Lillian remained silent, but a slight warmth appeared in her eyes. The next day, on Saturday morning, while Lillian was holding additional classes with the students, Edward appeared at the classroom door. The children froze when they saw him, but Lillian gestured for him to enter. Join us if you'd like, she suggested. Edward sat at a desk next to the students, who were curiously examining their new adult classmate. Mark passed him a pencil and a piece of paper, and he began drawing circles to represent the planet's orbits. Lillian watched the scene, understanding that sometimes in life, you need to give someone a chance to return to a place where they once made a mistake. The Saturday classes were lively. Edward sat among the children, listening to Lillian explain the laws of physics. The children were surprised by his attention, and even by his attempts to join in their work. Mr. Edward, do you know how many planets are in the solar system? Lillian asked, unexpectedly. 9, he confidently answered, but the children laughed in unison. There are only 8 now, Mark corrected him. Edward smiled, acknowledging his mistake. Well, looks like I need to catch up with you, he said. By the end of the lesson, Lillian asked the children to review the material, and Edward helped as much as he could. He was amazed at how energetically the children grasped complex topics, explaining them to each other. When the lesson was over, Lillian approached Edward. You did better than I expected. It was tough, but interesting, he admitted, looking at the children who were already packing up their things. Now you understand why I'm here, and not somewhere else? She asked, closing her journal. I understand, he answered quietly. But that doesn't mean you have to do everything on your own. She looked at him, but didn't respond. Instead, she suggested, Since you're here, will you help me in the classroom? They headed to the new science room, where the telescope installation had already begun. Edward helped by lifting heavy boxes, while Lillian unpacked the new materials. You know, he began, this reminds me of our school days when we built planet models in your backyard. Back then, everything was simpler, she noted, continuing to unpack the boxes. Yes, but the dreams were bigger, he said, looking at her. Lillian froze for a moment, but then continued working, trying not to reveal her emotions. By lunchtime, they had finished and went outside into the schoolyard. The children were playing ball, and nearby, under a shady tree, Daniel was showing the other kids how to use the new microscope. Edward looked at the scene and quietly said, You were right. Sometimes, in order to change something, you have to start small. I've always known that, she replied with a faint smile. As they were saying goodbye, Edward lingered. Thank you for letting me be part of this. Let's see how long you can hold out, she replied jokingly, pointing at the dirt on his shirt from working with the boxes. He laughed and headed toward his car, while Lillian stood on the porch, watching the car drive away. On the day of the grand opening, not only students and teachers gathered, but also local government representatives, sponsors, and of course, Edward. Lillian stood in front of the students, holding the microphone. This classroom is our shared victory. You've proven that even from old boxes and lids, you can create a whole solar system, and from big dreams, real achievements. The children applauded, and Edward, standing a little to the side, never took his eyes off her. After the official part, the children ran to explore the new equipment. Edward approached Lillian as she was gathering her notes. You were magnificent, he said, handing her a bottle of water. Thank you, she replied, accepting it. But the real heroes here are the children. They inspire me every day. And you inspire them too, he answered. I saw their faces. They believe they can achieve anything. That's the most important thing, Lillian said, smiling as she looked at the kids excitedly examining the microscopes. I wanted to ask you something, Edward began. Why didn't you leave this town? You could have had other opportunities. Lillian thought for a moment before answering. Because here, I feel like I'm doing something real. This is my home, my students, my family. What about you? She asked, looking him in the eye. Why did you suddenly decide to come back? Edward paused, then quietly replied, Because I realized that all this time, I've been building something for others, not for myself. I was trying to prove something to others, but it didn't mean anything. And now? Lillian cautiously asked. Now I want to build something important that will last after me, he said. His voice was firm and confident. Lillian didn't respond, but her gaze softened. Later, when the students had gone and the school fell into silence, Edward approached Lillian at the classroom door. I'm leaving for a few weeks, he said. I have a lot of things to take care of. But I'll be back. I hope you find what you're looking for, she replied. I've already found it, he said quietly, looking her in the eyes. Lillian turned away, but her face betrayed a faint smile. When he left, she remained in the empty classroom. Her gaze lingered on the solar system hanging from the ceiling. Deep down, she felt that this conversation wasn't just a promise, but the beginning of something bigger. Several months passed. Life at the school went on as usual. The children eagerly attended the new classroom, learning about microscopes and telescopes. Lillian continued working with the students, her days filled with lessons, preparing for the science Olympiad and projects. One evening, as she was checking notebooks, her phone buzzed. The message was from Edward. I'm back. Can I stop by tomorrow? Lillian smiled. She hadn't expected his words about returning to be true, but she replied briefly. Come by at 9. We have a Saturday class. The next day, Edward showed up at the school again, but this time, something in his behavior was different. He was dressed simply, in jeans, a shirt, and a backpack slung over his shoulder, but there was determination in his eyes. Lillian, who was in the classroom going through materials for the lesson, was surprised to see him in the doorway. Edward? You're so early. I thought you were coming just for the Saturday class. We need to talk, he said seriously, stepping into the classroom. Lillian noticed how his voice trembled, even though he tried to appear calm. Is something wrong? Yes, he replied, taking a deep breath. I need to tell you something I've been holding inside for too long. She looked at him carefully, not understanding where this was going. I love you, Lillian, he suddenly said, his voice firm. Lillian froze. Her heart stopped for a moment, but then she frowned. Edward, what are you saying? You're married. He shook his head, his gaze full of pain. I'm not living with Juliet anymore. We tried, but he trailed off. It turned out to be impossible. We kept fighting, and the disagreements became unbearable. Is this a joke? She asked, stepping back a step, still not believing what she had just heard. No, he answered softly. I realized that all this time, I was searching for something that didn't matter. Money, status, power. None of it means anything without true feelings. And you've always been the one who understood me better than anyone. Lillian remained silent, trying to process his words. She looked away to hide the mixed emotions swirling inside her. Why did you decide to tell me this now? She finally asked, her voice tense. Because I don't want to live a lie anymore, he confessed. Since I met you again, everything has changed. You reminded me of who I am. She stayed silent for a long time, then exhaled and gave a weak smile. Did you really leave everything behind? She asked. Yes, he answered firmly. I made my choice. Lillian nodded, still not fully believing that this was happening. Then maybe we can try, she said softly, but without promises. I've lived in my own world for too long to risk it again. I understand, he replied, his voice filled with relief. But I'm ready to prove I can be part of your world. They met each other's gaze, and in that moment, Lillian felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was ready to give something new a chance. "Let's see where this leads," she said, smiling a little more confidently. Edward smiled in return, feeling, for the first time in a long while, that everything in his life was starting to fall into place. Several months passed. Edward not only continued to help Lillian at school, but also took on a significant portion of her financial needs. His foundation actively supported educational projects, from setting up new equipment to organizing the Science Olympiad and excursions for the children. Both students and teachers embraced the changes, and Lillian watched in awe as Edward transformed not only the school, but also himself. "You've really become part of our team," she said one evening as they wrapped up another event. "I didn't think you'd get so involved in the details." "It's important," he replied. "I want to leave behind more than just a building." Lillian smiled. "You're on the right track." Soon, Edward took another important step. He invited Lillian to dinner at his mother's house. "Mom's been looking forward to this moment," he said on the way. "Your mom is the sweetest woman," Lillian said with a smile. When they entered the cozy home, Mrs. Winscott greeted them warmly, immediately hugging Lillian as if she had been waiting for her. "Lillian," she said, her voice sincere and warm, "I'm so glad to see you." "Thank you, Mrs. Winscott," Lillian responded, feeling a bit awkward. "No formalities, dear," the woman interrupted her. "You're like a daughter to me. You know how I feel about you." During dinner, the conversation was light and relaxed. Mrs. Winscott shared her thoughts on Juliet. "I knew from the beginning that she wasn't right for my son. Too many ambitions and too little warmth. But you, Lillian, you're different. You're the one who can make him truly happy." Lillian was touched by these words, but carefully hid her emotions. After dinner, Mrs. Winscott escorted Lillian to the door and quietly said, "Thank you for bringing my son back to life. He hasn't been like this in a long time." Lillian just nodded, feeling the warmth of those words. As they were heading home, Edward asked, "So, what did you think of my mom?" "She's wonderful," Lillian replied, smiling. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of certainty in her heart that this path was one they could walk together. From then on, the school and Eleanor's home became their anchor points, where each day they built not only a future for the children, but also for themselves. Edward proved that he could change not only his life, but also the lives of those around him. Thank you for listening to the story until the end. Don't forget to share your thoughts on the story. Subscribe to Moonlit Stories channel and share this video with your friends and loved ones. It motivates us to keep working on new stories every day. Don't miss the next amazing story coming soon to your screen. We're truly grateful for having you with us. See you soon.